Hello, and welcome to the Arts Our Education Talk It Up podcast, where we chat with the national, state, and local leaders who are helping to make arts education part of every student's life. Arts Our Education is an initiative sponsored by the National Coalition for Core Arts Standards, a collaborative network of 8 national arts education organizations working to support equitable, standards-based arts education for all students. This month, we've been talking about the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Act, otherwise known as ESSER, that was passed in March to help schools throughout the country that have been impacted by the pandemic. And towards that, today we are talking to Kimberly Olsen, the executive director of the New York City Roundtable for Arts Education, and Gary Padmore, director of education and community engagement for the New York Philharmonic and co-chair of the Roundtable Board of Directors. Welcome, Kim. Welcome, Gary.
Great. Thanks so much for having us today, Jim. We're thrilled to be talking to you today on behalf of the Roundtable and eager to share what's been our experience here in New York City.
Well, thanks so much for being here. Gary, you as well. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm really excited to be in this conversation. Thanks.
All right. So let's talk about this. Can you tell me a little bit about the mission and goals of the Roundtable and who it serves?
Sure. So the New York City Arts and Education Roundtable is a grassroots service organization working to improve and advance arts ed here in New York. We are a mighty group that serves over 4,500 educators across the 5 boroughs, in addition to hundreds of cultural organizations. Now, together, these organizations and individuals work with schools and communities in every neighborhood across all 5 boroughs and beyond. The Roundtable serves as an info hub for this community, providing professional development, resource sharing, advocacy, as well as networking opportunities. We really operate on and by the belief that arts and arts education is a right for all New York students and all students for that matter of fact, and believe that in order to have equity and excellence in our schools, there must be universal access to the arts. I will say that we not only are advocating for equity and inclusion within our schools, but also a lot of our work brings us to advocating for equity within our cultural organizations as well, through different initiatives that are very much community driven and centered on anti-racist practices and social justice as well.
Gary, could you talk a little bit about maybe an example program that's going on right now to address those issues?
Absolutely. And first, I think as someone who's the director of education with the New York Philharmonic, the oldest orchestra in the country, we benefit greatly from the work that happens with the Roundtable, both as a partner, but also as a learner, through these experiences. So just one initiative that's specifically tied to the Roundtable that sort of amplifies what Kim's point was in terms of these more grassroots initiatives is a campaign that was really centering the leadership and wellness of our Black female colleagues in the field. And so we recognize, of course, especially through this pandemic, that there were many individuals that were impacted greatly, whether it be artists or administrators, but more specifically, we also recognize that Black women specifically had took the largest brunt of this, of this pandemic as it relates to their work, as well as their own overall wellness. And so there were 2 major campaigns tied to that. One was sort of a calling in of cultural organizations as it relates to the development and support of Black women in their own workplace, as well as the and that goes for organizations that are mostly white led, but also organizations led by people of color, because we recognize that we're all we all take a part in this system of oppression and also in dismantling that system of oppression. But then there was one more sort of step we took, which was a retreat that supported the wellness of Black women in our field. And so this past June, we were so honored to be able to welcome a number of women on the Camp Brown upstate New York, providing an array of workshops and wellness activities that really, affirmed, our value, our understanding of their value in this work. And so there are many other examples, but just to sort of highlight, I think those are definitely the two that are sort of near and dear to us and to me personally.
I really appreciate that, because I assume that we're talking about both teachers and teaching artists coming together to talk about the work that they do and the students that they serve. So that's really extraordinary that you were able to do that. The Roundtable's Arts Are Essential campaign. I know that it has been a huge challenge to get the New York City budget folks to come across with funds that would support your students and teachers across the 5 boroughs. But let's talk about that campaign. I think it's an amazing campaign. It is a model that other communities, both large and small, rural and suburban, could emulate. Could you talk about what that campaign's goals are and some of the data and the tools that you're using to move forward with that work?
Sure. So our Arts Are Essential campaign was launched in June of 2020, and it was launched in response to what we saw as devastating budget cuts to both the arts and education sectors. And of course, we knew at this time there was so much uncertainty, and we knew budget cuts were inevitable. However, so often the arts is the first thing cut. It is disproportionately impacted, and we did not want that to be the case again. So we, as the Roundtable, helped form a coalition of artists, organizations, cultural workers, educators, parents, students, all the way up to the cast of Hamilton, and activated this coalition to reach out to their city council members, urging them to preserve arts education in the FY21 city budget, so our 2020-2021 budget. And unfortunately, there were cuts. While we were grateful that our CASA, or after school programming, was received only minimal cuts, there were just devastating cuts across the board, not only to cultural partnerships, arts services, supplies. And it's been a rough year since then for our field as we work to rebound. And I should say there's a saying in the New York community that says culture never closed. So despite these cuts, art has very much been happening in our schools and communities. Unfortunately, arts education is only happening in some of our schools. And so we've continued our campaign since June and used it as a vehicle for educating representatives on the value and importance of arts education, that it's so much more beyond the picture or the performance that happens at the end. But as part of that campaign, we've hosted legislative briefings with city council members and members of the Department of Cultural Affairs. We've also activated hundreds across all 5 boroughs to write letters, to send emails, to call their representatives, letting them know why it's important to fund arts education. And then in this most recent budget cycle, so for our FY22 city budget, which was just passed on June 30th, we continued with our campaign, knowing that our city and state was not facing those same budget cuts. And instead of trying to just get back to the floor, advocating so that we are using this unique moment in time as an on-ramp for equity. For arts education in our schools, knowing that access, even pre-pandemic, was not near equitable, knowing that funding was not near where it needed to be. And so once again, contacting our representatives. Unfortunately, we didn't see the results that we had hoped and are still very much waiting to hear on specific line items related to arts education. But in a time where New York has passed a $6.9 billion budget that includes relief funds and also about $530 million in foundational aid, funding should not be an excuse for why every student doesn't have arts education this year.
Gary, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of unfortunately not a surprise when we think about support in the arts. To Kim's point, I mean, there's certainly been a track record in New York City as it relates to where it prioritizes the arts in New York City. Certainly being, at the Roundtable and having that sort of 30,000 foot view, it gives us the ability to kind of see what's happening around New York City. But it's not, but I think specifically within my own organization and for many colleagues that I've been in communication with, this is really problematic. I mean, we're talking about a period that is deeply traumatic, especially for young people. And the arts is really, a means by which folks, educators and young people alike, are able to heal and find ways of communicating, et cetera. And we're losing out on these experiences. And it's not like we can go back and fix it. I mean, obviously we have to move forward, but as we move forward without the same resources, it only reinforces the same areas of trauma that we're still dealing with. And I would say furthermore, tied to this work, when we talk about the idea of equity or inequity, specifically, Black and Brown communities are the ones that are mostly impacted, by this, lack of support in terms of the arts. Because when you look at, more affluent communities, the arts typically is a part of that system. There's different levels of support that ensures that the arts can happen and they can thrive. But as it relates to, communities where that is not, readily available, we're seeing the same, an even wider gap as it relates to it, both in terms of the school districts, but also to community organizations that are trying to support that work as well.
So we're talking about New York City, the cultural hub of the nation, if not the world. And we are talking about arts education literacy for the students in the community. Why would this matter to a community on the other side of the country or in the Midwest, I guess is the question. I wondered if you could address that. Why is what New York City does for its students matter to students anywhere else in communities? Any thoughts about that?
Sure. I think not only is New York City, in my mind, a cultural and artistic hub, if not leader in our country, it's also the largest school district in the country as well.
Right.
And oftentimes I see us as having a position to be a trendsetter in how we are connecting our schools with different community organizations, or how we're providing an equitable and excellent education that should include sequential, high quality arts ed. Yet despite our position as an arts and cultural leader as a city, our community is still left pleading for arts education to be valued. And yet, if it's something that is, arts and culture is 13% of New York City's economy, which is massive. And to not see it valued, the arts education valued in our schools, and to see, and by valuing, I also, I operate on the model that a budget is a moral document. And if it's something that we say we have value in, then that should be reflected in the money that's allocated to it. And to not see it reflected there is just so disheartening. I will also say all students across the country, regardless of what setting you're in, everybody is living through a moment of trauma. There is a need for community building. There is a need for social emotional learning. There's this need for evidence-based interventions, especially for our Black and Brown students, as well as for our multilingual learners and our students with disabilities. We know as practitioners that arts education works. The research is there. The studies are there, long-term, short-term, any setting. Yet it has to be invested in. There has to be money put towards it. So often it's seen as a nice to have and not a must have, that it just happens with limited resources. Imagine if you did put some resources to it. Imagine what impact it could have at any level, is how it equates in my mind. But Gary, what do you think?
Yeah, I think to reiterate Kim's point, New York, I think New York City, I was seeing a number, I believe it costs about $123 billion in terms of art, the sort of expenditures tied to the arts. And, through the arts, we're talking about over 500,000 jobs each year that are tied to the arts, whether it be, someone working with a culture organization, a teacher, et cetera. It's all, the magnitude of that impact is obviously,
an economic driver. Yes.
Absolutely, 100%. And I think, and to also to Kim's point, New York City, as of right now, maybe today is slightly less, historically has served over 1 million students within its system. But New York City also happens to be one of the most segregated school systems in the country. So as we think about, the arts, and as we think about such a large mechanism, I think now is the time, especially given the zeitgeist in our country, to really, take a deeper look at what is missing within our system. Like what are things that we need to offer every single child? And I think the arts is certainly a driver in that. And I think, it's not limited to the Philharmonic, it's not limited to, the large quote unquote organizations. Every single community is rich in culture and artistry, et cetera. And the sort of the financial support that's needed is absent as right now. And so I think, as it relates to schools, I think, we have the potential to be a model, but I think, because of where we are in New York City, but also we have the potential to just learn and grow ourselves, as within our own city, if that makes sense.
So what do you say to a policymaker, a legislator? As you know, I don't believe any legislator gets before a podium and says down with arts education. However, what do you say to a legislator who is of the mind that the arts and art making simply will take care of themselves? In other words, what is the infrastructure, the teachers, the funding, the teaching artist, all of the things that need to come together to make a quality and equitable arts education? What do you say to them to get them to cross over to understand what is needed and why it's needed? That's a kind of a multi-question. I'm worked up now. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I don't. Me too. You're right, though. I've in my experience in advocating, I've yet to come across somebody who has said, no, I absolutely do not support arts education. I do not want it in my schools. In terms of what we're advocating for, it's not really a controversial topic. But oftentimes, like I said earlier, it's seen as enrichment or extracurricular or an add-on, something that's nice to have, as opposed to what I find is that it's really just a matter of educating on what is the actual value of arts education, that it's those skills that are built during these artistic experiences, like creativity, like collaboration, like eye contact, that are ones that are then going to serve students well beyond their artistic practice, whether they decide to have a career in the arts, which is great, or whether they don't, and they just take the skills that they've learned and are able to apply it in other settings. I feel like something that is has been an interesting conversation in New York State in particular is that the arts is not considered a core academic subject here. We are one of 19 states that doesn't consider arts to be a core subject. Our current education policy, that section dates back to the 1950s and arguably is in need of an update. And as myself and other advocates across the state have been engaging with state policymakers, everybody's been overwhelmingly supportive. There's been great bipartisan support. But it comes into question, what oftentimes I hear is, well, why is the arts more important than, say, teaching about nutrition or teaching about the Holocaust? And it's a matter of educating policymakers that no, this is a discipline. This is a subject area as opposed to a unit of study that is found within a social studies curriculum or English or math or what have you. Yeah.
Just to add, I mean, I think I would say to the legislators that we need to look at education holistically. And I think, the arts are essential, just as any other subject area a child is learning in school. Furthermore, the arts are essential in a broader sense where we have full-time teachers, full-time arts teachers in the schools, but then we also have the support of cultural and community organizations that are helping young people to look at these experiences more directly, and more robustly. Because it's just as important for a child to learn to play the trumpet in school as it is for that child to be able to go to a show and see a performance, or to experience theater, or to have a guest artist come in to help reinforce the importance of that experience. And so I think there are multiple areas of the arts that we need to look at, but it can't just be one and not the other. And I would say to the legislators as well, if they believe strongly in the development of a child, then put your money where your mouth is. Then support the arts in a way, and support education in a way that is holistic and that truly ensures that a child can succeed and thrive through adulthood.
So let's talk bread and butter here. Let's get specific in terms of what you are asking of the New York City Council members. Is there a specific dollar amount, for example, that you have asked them to budget ESSER funds in support of arts education?
Yes. So in our ask to City Council and the Mayor's office and to the Department of Education as well, after sort of crunching the numbers and looking at the DOE budget, we saw it would take about a $250 million infusion of stimulus money to help close the equity gap and act as an on-ramp towards sustainability for arts in our schools. And broken down more specifically, what that would include is $50 million to support the Arts Education Strategic Plan, which was developed under the late Paul King, who was the head of the Office of Arts and Special Projects, and is just a tremendous undertaking, and really lays out how we get from where we are now to ensuring that there's sequential arts education for all students. As also part of that $250 million infusion of stimulus money, we were asking for funding for art services, knowing that within the New York State ESSER plan, there was specific call out on community partnerships.
That's right.
And so that funding go to that, not only support those, which we know it takes a village in these settings, and also knowing the employment impact that artists have faced, what a great way to be able to support both communities. And then on top of that, also looking, which really the meat of it, here in New York City, we have a school allocation memo called Arts Supplemental Funding. And this is a pool of money that each principal gets. It's under their umbrella of their fair student funding. And it's a certain amount of per capita spending on arts education. We were advocating for that to be increased from our $79 per capita to $120 per capita, which would be around $108 million for all New York City students. And for that in particular, why that's so important is we know the principals are the financial leaders of their schools. And currently that item in particular is just a recommendation. Mm-hmm. It varies from school to school whether principals actually do spend that per capita money on arts education or whether it goes to support another endeavor, because principals have a lot of difficult decisions they have to make. That used to be required back in I believe it was around 2004 to 2008, but has since changed. And so that's really the bulk of what we were asking, which equaled out to about 3 cents on the stimulus dollar for arts education. Of course, we know this is a unique year and that we then have to find ways to be able to sustain it beyond that. But why not use this as an on-ramp moment? And so we're still waiting very much to hear about certain aspects. What we've seen so far has been disappointing in terms of what New York City has stated in terms of their recovery plan. But arguably the categories that they have shared as their priority areas still have room for arts education. And we see it now as a matter of just educating and saying, yes, let's prioritize social emotional learning, but this is how you can do it through the arts. Or we understand early literacy for all. This is how you can enhance literacy and teach literacy through the arts, which we know is highly successful. So that's what our ask is. We're still very much waiting, like I said, though, to see how the chips fall over the next few months.
Gary, something to add?
No, I mean, I think Kim really said it all. I mean, I think there's a very clear plan in terms of where money can go and what that money could look like. And I think to her point as well, this is funding that could easily be scaled based on community need, but I think it ensures that every child has access to the arts in a highly engaging way, which I think is our goal.
Well, we know that regarding stimulus dollars, that every school district in the country is receiving something like 8 times the normal amount of federal funding that they would in a normal year. So I love what you're saying about using the stimulus dollars as an on-ramp, as a beginning point to help build sustainability. Has there been any outreach to the incoming mayor, Eric Adams, in regards to this ask?
Yeah, it's something that we're currently working on from the Roundtable side. Prior to the primary elections, we did a mayoral survey of all of the candidates. We were lucky enough to get, I believe, around 13 to 15 responses. Yet we did not hear from the Adams campaign. So we're right now working to try to connect with him, share with him what the value of arts education, try to have him engage still as Brooklyn Borough President with different residencies or arts learning experiences that are happening just this summer. In addition to thinking about our city council as well, we're going to have a 75% turnover within our city council in this upcoming year. And it's going to be a lot of relationship building and educating these folks on why the arts are important, why these community partnerships are important to our students and to these broader organizations and the different groups that they're serving. And unfortunately, what will happen if arts education remains unfunded? It's really painting a picture of this is something that's essential to our schools. It must be universally accessible. And so we're looking forward to shouting that from the rooftops very soon, that's for sure.
And I also assume in this economic rebuild in New York City, we all know that there are huge numbers of teaching artists in New York City. I would think that there is a role here for them in this equation, this discussion as well. Yes?
Absolutely. I think as we talk about arts being essential, an essential driver of the arts, especially from the perspective of cultural organizations, is our teaching artists community. I mean, we, New York City, I believe happened to be the sort of mecca of teaching artistry, back in the 70s. And so in order for our work to thrive and succeed through this period, we need our teaching artists in partnership with our school teachers, of course. But I think, absolutely, our teaching artists are a critical part of this equation.
Yeah, I mean, the Roundtable has been fortunate to administer a couple of rounds of relief funding to teaching artists. That over our past season, we gave away almost $700,000 to teaching artists who were financially impacted by COVID. And I mean, that was barely 40% of all those who applied. Unfortunately, we were able to fund. We know from the Department of Cultural Affairs that they put together a fabulous report in, I believe it was May of 2020, that shared in just those early months of COVID. While we know the arts and cultural sector was impacted, within that, arts education was among the most impacted part of the sector. And despite that impact and despite uncertainty about employment and pay instability and healthcare uncertainties, we know from our relief fund of everybody that applied, 97% wanted to continue working in this field.
Wow, that's amazing.
There's commitment to our students, to our communities, but we're at risk of losing a highly specialized workforce, unfortunately, if we're not able to support the organizations that employ them, as well as the cultural partnerships that help connect these brilliant, incredible educator artists with communities throughout the city.
And I assume you're also doing outreach to your arts education, your certified educators as well.
Yeah, I think one of the most astounding parts of this year, I mean, our in-school educators are my heroes of this year. They log in, day out, or are coming into schools with so much uncertainty, yet finding a way to make magic. So often I hear, especially from our certified teacher counterparts, that students will say, oh, I came to school today because I knew I had music class, or, oh, I couldn't wait to do this puppetry workshop with you. However, despite the clear interest that it brings for students and way that it builds community, we know in New York City, 22% of certified arts teachers were reassigned and using more of their time to teach outside of the arts, to accommodate social distancing and remote learning. We hope that goes back next year, but there are no guarantees. So we are very much advocating for those teachers to not only be returned to teaching the arts, but also for there to be an increase in hiring for arts teachers as well after the hiring freeze this year. And also just an additional certification of arts teachers. Yes. That we know from the New York State ESSER plan that more than 10% of arts educators in New York State, so certified arts teachers, are not certified in the arts. That has to change. So yes, and.
Yes, and. So let's try to bring this around to one final bit of discussion. What are you asking advocates, those who are residents of the 5 boroughs of New York City, how can they help you, the Roundtable, make the case for arts education funding in New York City? What would you ask them to do in the coming days and weeks?
Sure. Well, from where I sit, there are 3 action steps that folks can take to help with advocating for arts education in our schools. One of them is on our website, our Arts Are Essential homepage. We have a one-click tool that enables you to reach out directly to your representatives to let them know that arts education is important to you and needs to be valued and invested in as part of our New York City budget. I would say another way is here in New York City, we have a tremendous summer rising program happening right now, which is about a summer school equivalent, which as part of that, there was I will say to the DOE and to the Department of Cultural Affairs, a really nice investment in community partnerships between schools and cultural organizations. And so many are hosting, I think it's 199 schools are partnering with cultural organizations on pop-up performances and murals.
Wow.
If your school community is doing that, invite your representative to come see it. There is nothing more powerful than seeing the arts and experiencing it live, whether that's live in a Zoom or live in person. And third, I would say a preview, look out for a sign-on letter from the Roundtable. We're going to be penning one soon and sending it around to organizations in particular, calling on our mayor and our chancellor to invest in arts education in our upcoming year, knowing that there are still ESSER funds that are out there, and wanting them not only to be directed to arts ed, but also to have guidance around centering the arts to our principals who are the financial leaders. So three potential action steps, really education.
I would only add that I think, we all have agency as it relates to this work. And I believe that especially given the fact that, we've experienced such a high turnover with our city council members, coming up in the next few months, now is the time for individuals to contact folks that are in their immediate communities as it relates to this support. And so, so I think as I live in Forest Hills, Queens. I need to reach out to my city council member today to ensure that the arts will be essential in my district. If you are a teacher in the school, speak to your principal. I think we all have some bit of agency wherever we are in this entire ecosystem. And so just leverage what you have to ensure that this work can continue through next year and beyond.
Thank you both so much for being here and the advocacy work you are doing on behalf of the students, teachers, and everybody who invests in arts education in New York City. And honestly, I think so much of what you have had to say today is applicable no matter where arts education is at risk and needs to be maintained. To add on to Kim and Gary's call for action, you can visit the New York City Roundtable.org to email your council members and tell them that arts are essential only takes 60 seconds. Is that right, Kim and Gary?
60 seconds maximum.
Maximum. So please do support arts education in New York City. And Kim and Gary, just once again, thank you so much for being here. And in the coming days, we'll get this podcast up and ready and share it out with the world through social media. And please do come back the next time to the Arts Are Education Talk It Up podcast. We look forward to seeing you the next time. Gary, Kim, thank you so much for being here. Signing off now.